scientist?
Yeah, so I would say that was a long process to decide that I wanted to be a scientist. So I enjoyed a lot of things when I was in school. And I think it's very interesting to see how science is presented at different points in your training. So in high school, for me, a lot of science was dissecting things that were infixative in sort of a rigid frog or something. And that really didn't appeal to me. That's not the kind of biology I was into. And so I felt in some ways, I'm like, well, I don't know if I'd want to be a scientist, because a lot of the science that was presented to me in high school, I didn't have much interest in until I hit something that was more genetics and molecular biology, and I was hooked. Because I was like, this explains some of the underpinnings of all of biology, and I was like, this is really fascinating to me. So I really didn't sort of get a strong interest in biology till I was a senior in high school. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to college and I'm gonna stay on this biology path and see how it goes. And I loved it. And it was, again, the molecular biology classes that really appealed to me, and that sort of set me up with getting the right advisor and then doing a summer research program, and that was it. I was hooked on research. I say I thought about this question a lot, about how I feel things are difficult, because I was so fortunate and have been so fortunate to work with amazing women, really amazing women. So I grew up with amazing women. And so if anybody were to tell me that women weren't as capable of doing science or to be in this career path, I would never believe that. Right, so I think I've been fortunate so that my own life experience has said that women are incredible scientists and people that I want to work with. And so I think what's sort of hard is, as I've been training even more, I think this has become more apparent once I hit sort of the PI level. I'm like, where are my fabulous women colleagues? Where are they? Because I think I had them all through training, and I'm like, but they're amazing and they know that they can be at this level. And so I think it was sort of difficult, is sort of feeling like they're not here anymore and wondering why. And at the same time, having so many fabulous female trainees and knowing that science is absolutely a place for them, but not being necessarily able to demonstrate that, because I'm one of few women at the PI level in my department and also at UVA. And so that's difficult, because it's trying to reconcile the fact that I know women are absolutely so wonderful at this job, and at the same time are underrepresented, and sort of trying to get at why, right? And that can be frustrating, because I want to encourage my trainees that they have a spot, they belong in science. But if you don't live that experience to see that can be even harder to sort of convince people, no, really, like, this is a job for women. And so I think that's some of the hardest things, and then we just face that at all sort of levels. Like, why aren't women winning this award? Why aren't women being promoted? Why isn't this happening? And so that constant sort of effort and constant sort of noticing of that can get a little bit tiring. But for the most part, I think that it's also inspiring to be like, no, let's just keep going. We got to stay here. We belong here. Let's keep doing it. So when I started graduate school in 2002, my class was very large. So we were a large microbiology program. And microbiology, so it's also interesting that it trained in somewhat of a different subspecialty than where I currently work. So I'm now in neuroscience as my official department, but I was trained in microbiology, immunology, which has traditionally had more women. But even so, I mean, there's more women in those conferences and in those departments across the country, yet the same sort of issues are still there too. It's just a little bit more stark in neuroscience. But my graduate class in 2002 was 3-to-1 women, right? That's 20 years ago. So it's like somehow we have no problem bringing women through to that point, and even into postdocs, but then sort of we have to really figure out what's happening. There's a lot of talk about the pipeline, but I think that there's more of a recognition that that's maybe not it. I think that there needs to be a lot more of like welcoming communities. So like making, like when you come in to make feel like you're not, that you identify with people and that you have a network and you feel supported in doing what you do instead of feeling like you're different. No one really wants to show up every day and be like, why am I always fighting against the grain, or why do I feel different every day? I think that's pretty exhausting. And also to be told that you can't really have what you want, which I think is a misnomer, or not a misnomer, I just think it's misleading. Yeah. Yeah, so I would say that, and I try to tell my students this often too, that not everything works all the time, and being really persistent matters. So there were often times when maybe things weren't working or weren't moving as quickly as I wanted them to. I think we often compare ourselves to others too. So we might come into a new position and be like, wow, this seems to be easier for everyone else. Why isn't it as easy for me? And so then you might sort of say, well, if it's not easy for me, should I be doing this? I think I was really persistent, and I was very, very grounded in why I was doing science. I was always interested in, and I still am, like, well, why does this work the way it works, and how amazing is it to discover things? And if I remind myself of that often enough, that's enough inspiration to keep me going, right? So even when things are tough, I'd be like, no, I'm still here because I really love that thrill of discovery, and that's enough to keep me going. And in being persistent too, I think that if you just keep going, keep showing up, and I think I told myself early on, I said, I think I've selected a fairly difficult major in college, and I think I've selected maybe a difficult graduate program, but I don't really know what difficult means yet, so I'm gonna try it. And if I feel like I cannot do it, that's okay. I will have just tried it. And so I've sort of said, well, it might be difficult, but I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna give it a try. And if I feel, so I've always taken that pressure off of myself that I had to absolutely succeed. It was more so, I'm gonna go and give it a good try. And if it's just truly not for me, but I'm not gonna psych myself out of it at the beginning. I'm gonna sort of say, I'm interested enough, I'm persistent, I'm gonna see how hard it was. And what I found is that there are hard moments. There are times when you don't sleep as much as you want to. There are times when you're frustrated, but I've been fortunate enough to get through those times that I've been sort of like, oh, and then I made it through and I'm okay. And it challenges you in different ways, but no way where you actually kind of feel like you're so challenged that you've got to say an amount, right? And so that's what I sort of, tell people. I'm like, don't take yourself out of it too early. Just because we don't really know what we're getting ourselves into. I think, when I started grad school, I was like, I think I know what to expect. I was completely wrong, and I just sort of was like, okay, well, here we go, we keep going. And you learn to see what parts of this job you really, really love and what keeps you going. And so I think that in those moments when you're sort of doubting yourself, it's always so helpful to come back to like why you're there in the first place. Yeah. So I'd say the other thing that I've done all along is been quite a talker with my friends. I've had wonderful people that I could just sit down with and we'd talk for hours, not knowing we really needed to, but then sort of say, oh, and then they say, well, what I'm hearing you saying is you really love so many parts of your job, and there's this other part of your job that's really getting to you, but it's not the core element of science. You still love science. And I'm like, oh, I do. You're right, I do. And those are some really helpful conversations when you're trying to figure out what you want to do with yourself, is sort of, because I think that maybe the time I struggled the most was in my postdoc, when I was surrounded by some just really exceptional scientists, but we were all at different levels. So when I was a newer postdoc, I was like, man, these people are so good. I would like to be as amazing as them. And I just wasn't giving myself the patience to get to that point. Don't try to, as a second year postdoc, don't compare yourself to a fifth year postdoc that's about to get a job. You've got some developments to do, and that's okay. And then try to work for the people that know that too, right? That they're gonna say, I know that, and that they wanna invest the time in you. And so I know I was very lucky in getting some really supportive mentors who were like, I think you're going to be okay, but that give you the 5 years to be, to mature. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, and sometimes it's good to like figure out like, where is my stress coming from? And so I know in some situations that can be external stressors, but I know that a lot of people hold themselves to such a high standard. And that's maybe how we've achieved, right, and done well so far. But sometimes it's sort of coming to the point of being like, I'm going to know that I'm trying my best and that's what matters to me. And once you get that sort of calibrated, and it can take a while to be like, so I can maybe alleviate some stress knowing that I'm putting the stress on myself, right? And so, I mean, I think this is always just something we continue to learn as we go through every stage, because I think that the way that we treat ourselves and how much stress and pressure we put on ourselves, and how we handle maybe some of those external pressures when they get layered on that's constantly evolving. So just having somebody to talk to about it, whether, it's friends or, people who are really good about strategizing and knowing, how to handle pressure is really great. Yoga is wonderful. Like there's so many things that you can do to sort of like move through that and sort of eliminate some of the stress that you're like, that might not be necessary. Because I'm like, those fifth years were second years once. And maybe even go ask those fifth years, because I've been talking to my students now that are more senior, like, oh yeah, my second year self needed to hear some things, or like that it'd be okay. It'd be just fine. Yeah, I think I'd probably give myself a few pieces of advice. I think I did well in selecting mentors, but I just didn't really know how important that was. And so I still don't even know how I was as lucky as I was, but I worked for people that I kind of felt were wonderful people at their core. And so I would say, do that, keep doing that. But as far as, I think that at some points in my career, I was way too hard on myself and sort of got really focused, learned a lot, did a lot of things, which I don't regret. But I think that at some points I could have taken some pressure off of myself and had a lot more fun. Because I think that I always say this, and I really do believe it, that it's a marathon. And so at no point in my career have I wanted to run myself so hard that I would jeopardize my ability just to function in a month or a year or something. Like, this is absolutely a marathon. And so I think that I would have probably told myself that a lot more, of like, absolutely invest yourself, because I think there's always that balance of like, you are so invested and you want to try so hard, and you can, so you should, but you should also really start to recognize when you might be sort of saying like, I could use a break, or I could stand to have or develop a hobby or get a pet or something. And that's always so hard to know what that point is of where you're sort of saying, I now have the bandwidth to do that. Because sometimes it can feel overwhelming to be like, I'm going to add in more layers of trying to balance a hobby now. Are you serious? Right? But at some point you'd be like, oh, I think I needed that. And one thing that I did start doing is I'd probably tell myself to read more for fun. Because I think it helped me be a better science writer. But at the same time, I really enjoyed reading just for fun. So those are the types of things that are just sort of like, take a break, recharge. And I think a lot of people say that, try to find the balance. And I think what can be hard to recognize is when you need that for yourself. So always having a network around you of people sort of that would tell you, I think you need a little bit of a break, and to trust them, and maybe have them plan the trip as well. That's always helpful.
That's a great. Just yesterday we had a conversation about me wanting a dog. I was like, I don't have time. I'll be in the lab the whole day. And all I was like,
if dog would be unhappy. At the same time, I know her and I know how happy it would make her, and like she'll just make it work and adjust her lifestyle. Really,
to make it work.
Yeah.
I faced that decision, and I think I just hit a point where, as a postdoc, I was like, I'm getting a dog. I'm doing it. And my lifestyle wasn't so conducive to a dog, so I got a bike and I started riding back and forth, and so it was great exercise too. But it changed my life to have that other thing to care for, and one of the best decisions I ever made. And did I know it was the right time? It just seemed to work. It seemed to work for me, and I know that it doesn't always work for everybody, but if you're really committed into it, it's wonderful. Yeah.
Oh, well.
I'm a dog person though. So.
Awesome. So our last question is, how can we support women in science?
That's a good question, and I think I probably draw the most on my fabulous women colleagues and the people that I've met over time. These are people I've trained with, people that I've met over time, and I have benefited so much from their support. And so the way this typically works is they might be the people that say, I'm going to nominate this person, or I'm going to champion your work. Some of the best ways we can do that is, so there's been a lot of great research showing, and I won't be able to cite it off the top of my head, but if we have representation on selection panels and representation on committees that plan conferences and do various things, you tend to have a more represented either panel or lineup of speakers or something. So in so many ways, that might be like saying, well, if you have the opportunity to be on a selection panel, do it and make sure that women are selected, right? So that's one way that we absolutely can do this. And sometimes I feel like, what advice would I give to men too, right? To support women in science, because I think that's just as important, because I don't think it's just up to us to support each other. We absolutely need to do that, but I think that we need support from everyone. And so I think that the best piece of advice, I think in all ways, is to be more aware. Just be aware. Try to notice when things are happening, and maybe that they shouldn't, because I think for the longest time I wasn't always aware of all of these undercurrents of exclusion, or when women weren't represented, or the people were saying something, and maybe I wasn't as aware. But as I've become more aware over time, I'm like, oh, that's maybe not what that person intended to say, but I maybe should have said something, right? And so the more aware we get, the more likely we are to stop ourselves from making these mistakes, and then maybe be able to help other people. But the more aware we are, that's maybe the best place to start, and then to start making those steps to making yourselves better. And that's really helpful, because I think that other just really concrete examples can be, if you're writing a letter of recommendation, maybe read it to see if you've used some words or descriptions of female trainees that are unnecessary, that maybe you would never use to describe a man. But so these are things that we are maybe not super aware of, but once we are aware of, we can curb these behaviors, and then be far more supportive of women. So I would say that it's going to come from everybody. But I think that the other thing that we have to be incredibly aware of, that even if we reach sort of equivalent numbers of women being represented, we have to still make sure that we're still not talking over women in meetings, that if women are speaking and they make a great point, that somebody just doesn't reiterate the same thing they just said, that somebody calls that out. And that can be another woman, but it can also be a man, to say, oh, they just said that. That's wonderful. We've got consensus there. However you handle that. But that takes some practice, and it takes a little bit of courage to insert yourself in those situations. And not everybody feels compelled to do so. They might say afterwards, like, oh, that situation wasn't ideal, but I didn't say anything. So I think, but you might not even be aware of a situation being problematic if you're not sort of raising your own awareness as to how bias tends to present itself in science. So I'd say take the unconscious bias training, understand where your blind spots are, do some work. I think this is what we all need to do. I'm sort of saying generally. And then women to women, I think that we need to be as kind as we can to each other. That tends to be a thing where we hold ourselves to high standards. We're going to place that our own standards onto other people, and we can be quite not as supportive as we want to be, right? And so I think that once we get into places where we have some power, bring people along, right? That's the goal. And so we got to stay in science, right? That's the thing. And then as we start to get more representation, bring other people along, raise that awareness, and I think we're gonna make some. Hopefully we'll make some changes faster than we have. That's my hope.
Oh, that was amazing. Yeah, I think no one from our previous guests just brought up those little things that are so important. Be kind to one another, raise this awareness, and I think really need to keep repeating that and encourage people.
It's a very important perspective.
Yeah, and part of this was like, okay, so I know a few things that do work that I've seen happen, but not everybody has all the answers, right? And so I've just been really lucky to train with people who are also not as afraid to say something, right? And a lot of people will say, Tajie, you're fearless. I'm like, am I? No, I don't think so. I think I've just been told that my voice matters, right? And so I thank my previous mentors for that, because I think they definitely showed me a way that you can do science but be kind. You can do science and be a human, the human you want to be. You don't have to sacrifice that to do science. You absolutely shouldn't sacrifice that. And so when you're sort of taught that model and you can be the scientist you want to be and not compromise, that's pretty empowering. And then so you get papers written. So I'll point you to one written by Marion Pepper. It's called Hey Man. And I think is in Nature Immunology. And so it was just sort of saying, how can you be a better colleague to women? And so Marion and I trained with the same person, and he has trained many female faculty members, because I think that he just was sort of like, your voice matters. And anyway, he just seemed to do very well in empowering women to be leaders. And so how do you do that exactly? You know what I mean? That's always like what's the best combination to make sure that people feel empowered and feel like they have a voice and feel like they can be themselves, because that's what you really want. You want people to be able to understand other humans too, right? So otherwise you've got a lot of people training other people and not being empathetic enough to know what they're going through. And I would say that we all receive training in this as scientists, right? This is sort of how we get treated as humans. And so, yeah, it's a tricky business, but I think that as we train as scientists, we got to realize that from the very beginning, we start training other people. We start leading right away, because you even as grad students, if you're training undergrads or TAing college courses, you're already starting to help that next generation. And so how do you help other people along? And a lot of it is understanding that other people's lives are not the same as yours. You've got something to learn from them. And how do you navigate that? And then understand, and then what you will understand is that they're all outstanding scientists. We all have a place here. And so let's try to work towards that. Yes. And I think that a lot of people can train with people who aren't perfect, because people aren't perfect, right? The more that we recognize that and sort of say, that's okay. So that might take patience, on both sides. And it's a lot of saying I'm sorry when you don't really want to say you're sorry too. Like, just to be like, oh, I probably wasn't my best self there. And so if you can get that on both sides and people at least really wanting to do that, that's fine. People will evolve. Yep. And so that's also hard too, to always keep those lines of communication completely open, but it's pretty key. So, yeah.